Hello, and welcome to the newest episode in Dialogue Topics. I'm Taylor Petrie, editor of Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. This season, we're talking about the history of LDS scholarship on specific themes, exploring a topic in depth, and to consider how dialogue has been a forum for these important issues since its founding. We'll also bring you up to date on these topics with our more recent issues to discuss some of the current trends. All of our topic pages are curated to bring you comprehensive collections of annotated scholarship and may be found at dialoguejournal.com/topic pages, all one word, or navigate there from our homepage. You'll find amazing resources and research on tons of issues. This month, we're looking at the history of scholarship on the Book of Abraham. And this is an exciting time in this field. The Joseph Smith Papers Project has published the manuscripts in critical edition. There are also a couple of new books, one by Terrell Givens with Brian Hogland, The Pearl of Greatest Price, and Dan Vogel, Book of Abraham Apologetics. But the story that I want to tell here is the history of scholarship as seen through the pages of Dialogue, including the foundational role that the journal played from the very beginning when the Joseph Smith papyri were rediscovered in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City in 1967. This was a huge moment for Dialogue as the hub for open discussion of this groundbreaking new find. Imagine if we found the gold plates and then had a chance to study them and translate them, and it turned out that they didn't say anything like what the Book of Mormon says. That's basically what happened with the Book of Abraham in the 1960s when the papyri were discovered. Since then, the question of the relationship of the Joseph Smith Book of Abraham to these ancient documents has been a source of intense debate and has been used as a wedge to mediate the authenticity of Joseph Smith's prophetic calling and translation abilities. Act 1. Discovery of the Joseph Smith Papyri. Unlike the Book of Mormon, Book of Moses, and Doctrine and Covenants 7, with the Book of Abraham, we actually have a unique feature that we can compare Smith's translation with the source text for the first time. This is true not only for the text, but also for Smith's interpretation of the three images, facsimiles 1, 2, and 3. Joseph Smith had purchased the authentic Egyptian papyri along with 4 mummies in 1835. This was a period of traveling exhibits and Egyptomania in American culture. So while it is a little remarkable, the fact that ancient mummies and papyri ended up in frontier Ohio wasn't totally strange. Smith was interested in translating the documents and almost immediately declared them to be records of the patriarchs Abraham and Joseph. These original texts are the Joseph Smith papyri, and their discovery, or rediscovery, in 1966 sent shockwaves through the church and broader American culture. They'd been thought lost for over 100 years and were presumed destroyed in the Chicago fire in 1871. On November 27, 1967, the Metropolitan Museum of Art gave 11 Egyptian papyri fragments to the church that had once belonged to Joseph Smith, and even had his handwriting on the accompanying paper. They'd been acquired by the Met in 1947 and sat in the basement of the museum for decades, unaware of their significance. The winter 1967 issue of Dialogue was the first to cover the topic, and printed pictures of the documents with BYU studies just behind. This first issue also had exclusive interviews with Professor Aziz Atiya of the University of Utah, the non-Mormon professor who had discovered them by accident while doing other research. He recognized them immediately given his familiarity with the LDS texts and belief, and then Hugh Nibley from BYU was consulted to authenticate them. You can imagine that there may have been a lot of initial hope in some quarters that these would vindicate Smith's prophetic translation abilities. Others may have expected them to reveal that he was a fraud. In 1912, Egyptologists had already challenged Smith's translations of the facsimiles, so scholars were aware of potential problems, but it had also been mostly ignored by Latter day Saints. But the papyri changed all that. Right from the start, in the preliminary reports published in Dialogue, the documents were recognized as coming from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. They didn't have definite dates for them yet, but they knew that they were much later than the time period of Abraham. The summer 1968 issue followed up with the first translations of these documents based on the photos that the church had published in the Improvement era, as well as another that had been discovered in the church historian's office, and with a roundtable on the subject. Dialogue editors commissioned Egyptologists John Wilson of the University of Chicago and Richard Park of Brown University to produce the translations and initial analysis. This issue also included analysis from two people who opposed the authenticity of the Book of Abraham, including anti-Mormon Gerald Tanner, as well as an essay by RLDS church historian Richard P. Howard and another by Hugh Nibley. It was the true spirit of Dialogue to bring in lots of different perspectives on these new discoveries. So it was confirmed. The translations did not have anything to do with Abraham nor the facsimiles. They pointed out that the documents were spells from the Book of the Dead belonging to an Egyptian woman and the Book of Breathings belonging to an Egyptian man, and dated them initially to 500 to 300 BCE, respectively, which was too early according to later analysis. Facsimile 1 is fragmentary, but it shows a jackal-headed Anubis over the dead body of Osiris, with Isis in the form of a bird hovering over Osiris's erect penis to be miraculously impregnated by his dead body. These texts would be buried with the dead as a guide to the afterlife. This is not a sacrificial scene at all, despite its representation as such in the explanation of the facsimile. Even if the surviving documents weren't used for the Book of Abraham, getting around the mistranslations of the facsimiles wasn't really possible. Just to clarify, because it can be hard to keep track, this initial assessment is important, but further study has shown that the 11 fragments are all funerary texts and actually make up 3 separate documents. 2 are from the Book of the Dead for 2 different women, and the third is the Book of Breathings for a priest named Hor, H-O-R, sometimes called Horos, H-O-R-O-S, who we actually learn about from later discoveries as a Ptolemaic-era priest from Thebes, so he's a known historical figure. Now, all of this happened to coincide with another development in the 1960s. Joseph Smith and his close companions produced something called the Grammar and Alphabet of the Egyptian Language, which is actually multiple documents and contains the only copies of the facsimiles 2 and 3, which are now lost. Anyway, this project was their early attempt to develop a systematic translation of the papyri when they were copying down the Egyptian characters and assigning meanings to them. In 1966, just before the discovery of the papyri themselves, Gerald Tanner had published a bootlegged copy of the Egyptian Grammar and Alphabet. It's a strange document, but it shows that Smith didn't know the underlying languages independent from his translations of the Book of Abraham. Tanner's article in the 1968 Dialogue argued that Smith used the Book of Breathings in his translation of the Book of Abraham. Smith believed that the other scrolls, which we now know are the Book of the Dead, were a copy of the Book of Joseph, the ancient patriarch, the great-grandson of Abraham. But he never attempted a translation of that document that we know of. RLDS church historian Richard P. Howard saw the implications of all of this. Quote, "One real possibility would be that the Book of Abraham is not a translation at all, in the sense of transferring ideas from the Egyptian to the English language." Nibley, however, identified this as phase 1 and said, quote, "The investigation of the Book of Abraham has still far to go before we can start drawing significant conclusions." He offered a theory early on that there may be more manuscripts discovered and laid out a path forward for authenticating the Book of Abraham. It should proceed on the basis of the supposed ancient content of the book, not on its relationship to the actual ancient documents. He proposes turning to the ancient legends of Abraham as comparisons for Smith's versions. The correspondence between the ignorant Smith's Abraham and other ancient legends about Abraham was more than a coincidence for Nibley. He also attempts to draw some rather superficial parallels between the actual documents and the teachings of Smith, the Book of Abraham, and other LDS beliefs. But he also acknowledges that it was possible that the Book of Abraham was a revelation and not a translation at all. And thus, the terms of the debate were formed from the very first phase. The fall 1968 issue then offered another fuller translation by Egyptologist Klaus Baer from the University of Chicago of the funerary text, the Book of Breathings, or more accurately titled, The Breathing Permit of Hor, or was the deceased priest to whom the document belonged. This provided more precise dating for the documents, around 100 BCE during the Ptolemaic period. For the first time, a full translation of the text, as well as of the facsimiles and the Egyptian alphabet and grammar, was produced.
Beyond the Block, part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, is a weekly Come Follow Me podcast that centers the marginalized in Mormonism. Join Brother Jones and Brother Knox, a Black lifelong member and a queer convert theologian respectively, as they read the scriptures through the lenses of their identities and others in an effort to bring the culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints closer and more in line with its theology, which centers Christ's justice and compassion. New episodes every Monday.
Dialogue Podcast Network.